in the cyclone season. On the morning of Thursday, January 30th, 1936, I sailed from Melbourne. It was a grey morning with a fresh south wind, and I had to beat down the bay. I thanked heaven to be gone from Williamstown, which was not a pleasant place to spend a month, and I was mightily relieved when the huge sprawl of Melbourne was out of sight. A destroyer and a small steamer flagged their good wishes as we beat out. There was some slop in the bay, though it is almost inland water, and 2 of the gold men were seasick. The other 2 stowed away their considerable armament, and a colossal medicine chest and a tin trunk, made to be carried on a native's shoulders, but heavy enough for an ox. It was full of catheters and knives and things, and antiseptics and expensive preparations. But there was not a laxative in the outfit, or any quinine. It was the gentleman from Sudest who had planned this array. Even his leader looked at him dubiously as he examined it. They had a sack of picks and some tents and other gear with them, though not much. They meant to buy their outfit at Samaray. They were established very comfortably in the after 'tween decks, where they set about making themselves at ease for the voyage. Exactly why they were setting out in a full-rigged ship to sail to Sudest via Auckland and Samaray, when they could have travelled much more easily in a Burns Phillip liner, was a matter of some mystery to them. It was also a mystery to me. There were occasions when, thinking the thing over, I suspected that the value of the ship to the enterprise was perhaps not so doubtful after all. She had attracted a great deal of notice in Australia, and the voyage after gold, being somewhat unusual in these days, had had far more than its fair share of publicity. If the expedition discovered anything on Sudest of sufficient value to warrant the flotation of a big public company, the publicity with the ship had attracted to the beginning of the enterprise would make an excellent foundation for the campaign of funds. Whoever stood to lose by this voyage, and I was now losing heavily myself, the brokers of Collins Street, I thought, knew what they were doing. Well, I suppose that is their business. The formation of gold mining companies is always something of a gamble. I fear my Collins Street adventures rather sickened me of Melbourne, for which I had had no great esteem before, and the visit was quite spoiled. The ship, however, was treated very well, and the boys were given a good time. The Harbour Trust authorities charged neither dues nor wharfage, and the Pilots' Association, good fellows, took the ship in and out, and neglected to send in any bills for the service. It is not easy to take a full-rigged ship into or out of Melbourne, which is scarcely ranked among the best harbours in the world. I bought stores and food to last the ship to New York. I hoped and spent more than £1,000. I dry-docked the ship and cleaned her thoroughly. Whatever she needed she must have, no matter what the financial stringency. Advances to the crew, purchase of provisions, meats, rope, canvas, paint, oil, kerosene, charts, and stores took the rest of the money. Again I did my best to have the engine put in working order, for I knew the waters round Samaray to be worse than any we had yet sailed. It would be madness to be there without an engine. I had the engine thoroughly overhauled and shipped some extra drums of fuel. The ship was in need of a new set of braces to be cut and made from many coils of expensive rope. The rope I bought in Melbourne was excellent stuff. I knew I could take no chances with the cyclone season. The gear had to be perfect in every detail, for after the Coral Sea there would be Cape Horn. The customs officers of Melbourne, too, were much more human than their brethren in New South Wales. When I came to the customs house with my lengthy and voluminous inventory, so painfully compiled at the port of entry, the whole of the contents, except paint and canvas, we had not broached, did not exceed 50 pounds in value. They said, "Hello, what's this?" "That's the inventory," I said, pointing to the large columns and the multifarious entries labeled beer, bottled, quarts, Geneva and gin, bulk, tobacco, manufactured NEI, including the weight of tags, labels, and other attachments, pounds, opium pounds, confectionery, including candied and crystallized fruits, fancy goods, barber's stock, see endorsement on back, fish fresh, smoked or dried but not salted or preserved by cold process, oilmen's stores NEI, being groceries including culinary and flavoring, essences, non-spirituous, soap, dyes, conditioned foods, and other preparations used in the household, including food for birds, toilet paper, and so on, over 4 square feet. I pointed to the list showing our consumption, which, since we had bought everything ashore, was not much, and suggested that they had better come down and check the stuff. We might, after all, have surreptitiously consumed quite a lot of soap, dyes, or food for birds. I had gathered in Sydney that this would be the crucial point in my physical career. Making the inventory, they said, was nothing to checking it. I'd see. Well, I saw, sure enough. I showed the obliging officer my receipts for $1,100 spent in the country on fresh food and sea stores and all manner of things, and that was the end of the interview. Damn it all, they said, you've spent enough in this place, and they wrote upon my outward inventory consumption nil, and charged me no custom duties whatever. Well, that was sense. I'd brought in food that I had to have, worth about 50. I'd used as little of this as possible, and had spent 1,100. But it really was decent of the customs men in Melbourne not to go through the whole wearying rigmarole of checking and rechecking the inventory. It is the petty annoyance of these things, the interference with one's liberty, that hurts far more than the cost, which in my case at least would have been trifling. The laborious detail connected with the preparation and duplication of countless stupid and unnecessary forms is a real trial in bringing a ship to Australia and taking her away again. In Sydney I had had the help of an obliging shipping agent, but I had no such help in Melbourne. However, the officials were kind. I must say that never, at any time or in any port, did I have real trouble with an official connected with the reception of ships, nor did I ever meet one who was wholly unpleasant. They were doing their jobs, and they did not make the laws. In Melbourne I even found an honest ship chandler, who ranked at once with the only other 2 completely straight firms I knew in the whole world, one in London and the other in New York. But I found I had to keep a careful watch on the purveyors of provisions. I had the malaria experts on board to try to combat the miserable scourge. They did very well, though Melbourne is not a centre for tropical medicine. A pleasant Scots medical man, who was also a yachtsman, was a good friend to the ship in this regard. Dennis, the young cadet, was patched up very well in hospital, and when he returned on board with his sister and his doctor, both of whom chanced to be attractive young women, many many of the other boys regretted that they had not been caught cases too. Jan and the carpenter, who would hear of no hospitals, continued to be none too well. I received now, however, copious instructions for dealing with their cases, instructions which proved to be most satisfactory. I tried to get a doctor to sail with me, but could not. Some of the boys still had tropic sores, and the cook's leg, though saved, would require skilled attention for a long, long time. I was returning to New Guinea, In the worst season, a doctor would at least have taken the medical worries off my mind. The right doctor, that is, the wrong one would have added to them. I had to beat out of Bass Strait, for the wind stayed ahead. We saw Melbourne Head 2 days, and the night saw Tasmania. But in the course of time we passed into the Tasman Sea again, past Deal Island. It was then February, which is a comparatively quiet month in the Tasman Sea, a fact for which I was devoutly thankful. We could then concentrate upon getting the ship in thoroughly first-class condition for the passage of the Coral Sea. The 2 passages, for we should have to get away again from Sudest to the eastwards, and to beat out of the Coral Sea was the only way. I was going to Auckland to pick up some people who planned to sail with us to Tahiti from there, and the gold men needed a small boat. Our passage of the Tasman Sea was leisurely. There were no storms. The gold men, only one of whom was under 50, settled down and seemed to find the sea life to their liking, in the beginning at any rate. The man from Sudest, who in Collins Street had been represented to me as a master mariner, had been strangely silent on things nautical since he came on board, and he never ventured to hazard any suggestions, except that more ballast in the bottom of the ship would relieve the heavy rolling. His mental equipment, so far as I could discover, consisted principally of an array of facts about race horses and boxers, culled from newspapers and in bars. He was well informed about cricketers, though not about cricket, but though he could scarcely be considered as a contribution to the cultural standards of the ship, which were not high, he was at least quiet and not in the way. He seemed quite satisfied. The leader of the expedition was a man of different mold, a mining engineer well over 60. He was a man of vast experience. When he chose to draw upon the fund of his activities in Africa, Australia, the Far East, and throughout the islands, he was instructive and entertaining. I soon realized that he did not think much of the Sudest expedition. It was simply his duty to report on the value of the prospector's find, if any. It was for him to say whether an exploiting company should be formed or not. He seemed to me to be a man too important to be stowed away in a sailing ship for a 2-month voyage that would have taken a steamer from Brisbane to 2 weeks. But there he was. As the weeks passed, it dawned upon him, too, that his time could have been better occupied. He was, I presume, well paid. The other 2 members of the expedition, which surely must have been one of the strangest gold-seeking parties that ever set out, were an assistant to the engineer, a fine old chap who never did learn to stand up straight on the ship's deck, and a youthful roustabout. They were all glad when at last we reached Auckland, after an uneventful run of 26 days from Williamstown. I was glad too. At Auckland, a very pleasant place, which I had often visited in Tasman sea barks, there was a mild exodus of the older cadets. 5 of them left here. Fever of different kinds had something to do with the departure of 1 or 2 of them. The others felt that they had been in the ship long enough that it was time they got on with the serious business of living. With this attitude I was entirely in agreement, though unfortunately I was losing 2 of my best cadets. These were the cadet captain, Tony Evershed, who had to get back to England to be in time to enter one of the great universities, and a young American named Ed Lane, a banker. Tony and Ed were as stout fellows as ever walked the decks, and we missed them. Tony had been in the ship a year and a half, and Ed had been 14 months. The others had been a similar period, and at least they had had a fair taste of the life. At Auckland, too, the opportunity at last came to ship a British officer, a young man who had some real experience of square sail. He was an Australian who had been in the Mount Stewart and the Richelieu and in Tasman Sea barkentines. I shipped him and paid off the grain ship mate who had been with me from Copenhagen. I had to send the latter to his home at Helsingfors, which was an expensive business, and I should have to return the Britisher to New Zealand from England or America at the end of the voyage. This manning question is a difficult one in these days, particularly for me. I had trained 5 cadets to the point where some of them were stalwarts in the vessel and all were useful, only to have them leave. They were signed on for 3 years, but I never thought of standing in the way of any one's liberty. I could perhaps have kept them to the agreement they had signed, but I did not wish to do that. To the young men returning either to resume or to begin careers, this might have been unfair. So they went, and I had to look around hastily for others to take their places. It appeared that I had come to the right place. There had been hardly any applications for cadetships while the vessel was in Australia, and indeed there had not been a spare bunk there. I had not foreseen the exodus, the long spell in Melbourne, the difficult passage of the Coral Sea that was ahead of us, our return to the reef-ridden waters of the fever-stricken Melanesian islands, and the fact that we should certainly have to round the Horn in the depths of winter. These things had perhaps something to do with the thinning of our numbers in New Zealand. At first it seemed as if I should get no one in their places, but the New Zealanders are a sea-loving people, and the youth of the land has a thirst for adventure. Though the ship remained at Auckland only a few days and I did not advertise, I shipped 5 young New Zealanders. 2 of them, it is true, did not stay with us very long, but the other 3 were first-rate fellows. If they did not entirely make up for such stalwarts as Ed, Tony, and Fred Sturgis, who had gone back to work from Melbourne, 2 of them knew something of yachting, and they all 3 quickly settled down and became good mariners. They were well-built, solid fellows, quiet, decent, and intelligent, and that was all I wanted. More than that, I was glad to discover later that they possessed a moral standard higher than most. They were good representatives of the ship always. At Auckland I had had good tidings on the worrying financial side. I had had a windfall. I heard in the sale in America of the radio serialization rights of one of my books. A juvenile there was doing very well, and I was asked for more articles. This was good news if the fever had not still been so worrying, and I had not had the Coral Sea before me. My mind might have been at ease. I had indeed problems enough, as I well knew, and these were likely to grow rather than to decrease in the next 3 months. But for the time being, all was well. My finances were sound again. The gold men had got their boat, and we left Auckland more British in our personnel than ever. It was strange that I had had to go to the Antipodes to bring this about. I had shipped Jim Evans from the Grace Horror at Melbourne. He was a first-rate fellow, and I made him leading seaman. The man from Sudest, he who had been in Collins Street, master mariner, belated discovered that it was the cyclone season in the Coral Sea. I had kept this to myself. Most people don't know about tropic seasons. He now went to sea in wild alarm because he had read in the newspapers of a large anticyclone off the coast. This anticyclone bothered him exceedingly. He wondered why we laughed. It was February 27th when we sailed. I hoped to reach Samaray in between 20 and 25 days. If there were no cyclonic disturbances, the southeast trade would be a fair wind. Getting to Samaray ought not to be difficult. It was making sud-est afterwards, and then getting away, that might be awkward. The beginning of the voyage was quiet. I meant to pass close to Norfolk Island, if I could, to have at least a glance at that interesting place. But the wind was adverse. I did not have to make much northing before picking up a southerly wind, which soon developed into the trade, and for a time all went well. The trade was fresh, and we bowled along, having a fair wind which with good fortune might have seen me to Samaray. I could pick my way again. I chose the path through the Coral Sea, which was farthest from the greatest number of reefs and most free of obstructions. This was the old route up between the Chesterfield and the Ken reefs, and then midway between the Mellish and Lehau. The Coral Sea presented little difficulty from this angle. The days were pleasant, and we made a good progress. A British cargo steamer, probably on a great circle course from Panama towards Brisbane, came out of her way to signal her longitude, a gracious act on the part of her commander. The comparison of longitudes at sea was, in the old days, often the only method by which square-rigged ships on long passages could check their chronometers, the accuracy of which is the keystone of longitude observations. The steamer, having constant wireless time signals, and being able to check and recheck her position by radio bearings, can navigate much more accurately than the sailor. It was a little after noon when the Port Nicholson came up to us, and her officers had just reconned her noon position. It agreed very closely with mine, and for this I was glad. I had no wireless, and was now at least assured that the chronometer was keeping its rate. Once well into the tropics, I watched the weather like a hawk, the sea and the sky and the barometer, while cyclones by no means blow up every week. February and March are the worst months for them. They grow up when the trade wind is disturbed, and the hot sun of the southern summer upsets the normal current of the upper air. A cyclone once started, cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons are all the same phenomena, rushes madly through many hundreds of miles, destroying whatever comes in its path. The wind reaches so great a force, no sail can stand against it, and a ship without sails is not manageable. As the storm center passes, the sea rises so high and is so confused that it alone suffices to engulf many a small vessel. No sea storm is more dreaded than these tropic furies, whether in the Caribbean, the China, or the Coral Sea. They always grow up under the sun among groups of islands at the west of great oceans, the West Indies, the Philippines, Mauritius, and the Indian Ocean groups, the Melanesian Islands, and the uninhabited reefs and cays of the Coral Sea. If caught in the path of one of the lot of a sailing ship is desperate, a steamer can often run from the path of the storm. Today weather stations are dotted over most of the hurricane areas to send out warnings of approaching disturbances which may develop into the dreaded storm. I could not hear these warnings, but the hurricanes does not come unheralded. There are many indications, some of them infallible, if one is only able to read the signs and deduce what is coming. Action can often be taken to avoid, if not the storm, at least the worst of it, at all cost its center. The chief of these signs is in the sky, the ominous threat of which is unmistakable. The sunsets and the sunrises immediately preceding a hurricane are usually glorious, and they mean hell. Whiffs of cirrus radiating from an apparently fixed point on the horizon, halos about the sun and moon, a heavy swell for which no recent or present wind can account, an exceeding sultriness in the weather, an interruption of the barometer's diurnal range, all these are signs. We sailed on, hurrying, for I was anxious to be gone from that sea, and I watched and wished. It seemed for a while as if we should have a good passage through. Then the weather began to be worrying. On the 13th day we rolled along towards Samoray, with our broad wake streaming back over the high following sea, with the day gray and wet and overcast, with some squalls and frequent light rain, and the barometer higher than usual. At nightfall the sky was heavier, with some curious tints, and the clouds racing before the moon were serious. The sea was higher than it ought to have been, but it ran true. It is foolish to read the portent of a storm into signs which may mean nothing but rising wind, nor do all conditions which breed hurricanes invariably bring forth these monstrous winds. Some dissipate before they gather their full strength, some die out quickly before they have properly begun, but I watched very closely and ran on. On the following day the wind hauled to the north of east, freshening steadily, rising to the force of a moderate gale, and the diurnal range of the glass was non-existent. Later the wind remained true by east by north, and the sea grew out of all proportion to the weight of wind. The dawn was wild with a sickly hue, and all the torn clouds flying. It looked bad. There was a violent hue in the dawning, and a sullen cloud bank grew far out on the windward horizon. It began to look as if we were in for a cyclone. I was in a bad place. If I were caught in the dangerous semicircle of an advancing cyclone, that is to say, if I found myself in a position from which the whirling circular winds of the storm would sweep me into the storm's center, then I should have no alternative but to heave to. I could not heave to and drift for the waiting reefs to leeward of me, and on all sides except the north, towards one of which I must invariably be set. If I came anywhere near a reef, the ship was gone, and every one on board. Within 3 days there would not be a piece of rusted iron to show where we had been, or a piece of driftwood larger than a match. The combination of wild reefs and maddened wind can be too much for any vessel, even a full-powered steamer. I might very well be in a tight corner. I kept my misgivings to myself. It began to be obvious that we were in for it, and there was only one thing to do. Since the steadily rising wind remained in exactly the same quarter, we must be directly in the path of the oncoming storm. How far away was it? That I did not know and could not find out, but I watched closely for any shift which would indicate to me whether I lay in the navigable area, or what was very likely to be the fatal one. Still there was no change beyond the increasing wildness of the threatening sky and the growth of the wind and sea. Shall I heave to while there is still a chance? No, I cannot do that. I can only run, scud before the path of the storm. There is no room to heave to. Any dallying may be fatal. So run it is beneath as full a press of sail as the ship will stand, for I know that I must at least get past the worst of the reefs before the real storm breaks, that I may, if it comes to that, have a reasonable hope of lying to with some sea room. Run, run, she foams along at 10 and 11 knots. I know now that the ship is in the freshening gale of an advancing cyclone, which may yet dissipate. I can only run. The barometer falls and keeps falling. The sea rises and keeps rising, and is now confused. The sky is ugly and grows uglier. Run, run, how beautifully she does run. I keep the main topgallant on her, pinning my faith on the ease with which sail comes in. In this little ship, even in a high wind, and run, run, I run with the wind on the port quarter, and keep it so. Bound towards the north, rolling, rolling, the ship boils on. The foam creams before her in wild wonder at the crush on rush of her sail-crowded advance. As she treads down the waters, the spume blows above the yards, the sea booms, and the wind roars. Run, little lady. So I ran and ran and ran, 100 miles, 200 miles, 300 miles. Almost imperceptibly the glass began to rise again, and the wind eased, though it was squally and unsettled, and there was a deluge of rain. I saw the gray clouds in the heavy southern sky gone mad and rushing in circles, but we were gone then, thank God, from that part of the horizon, and I saw that the main topgallant mast was sprung, and that the trestle trees of the fore topmast had fractured on one side and sunk. This seriously weakened the ship aloft, but the cyclone had gone. The weather was disturbed for many days afterwards. I had run off to the eastward by keeping the wind on the port quarter, and now found it difficult to get this longitude back, but I still counted on the southeast season having set in towards Samaray, so that I should not be bothered with northwest winds and unsteady conditions when I made my landfall. The sets in these waters are always considerable and incalculable, but they are especially dangerous at the changing of the seasons. I did not know, and could by no means discover, whether it would be best to approach Samaray from west of it, reckoning on an east-going set left over from the northwest season, or from the east with the west-setting stream of the trade. The set had been steadily to the westward almost since leaving Auckland, but these problems in the Pacific are insoluble. I had to guess, I had to take a chance on it. As a matter of fact, I could not even do that, for we had no sooner picked up the first reef of the Papuan waters than the wind came howling out of the northwest at us, a quarter from which officially it should long have ceased to blow, so strongly that I could do nothing but head reach against it and drive almost bodily to leeward. There was no time even to be sure which reef we saw, for one reef is very like another, but observation showed it to be Uluma, a short 40 miles from Samaray. But the wind blew me away 200 miles, and we were another week beat back in that hot and humid atmosphere against the wind. The set and the sea was dogged to the point of desperation. The conditions were peculiarly adverse, combining in themselves such an array of difficulties for the ship to overcome that I sometimes thought of going to Sudeste, which was then close by, and throwing the gold men out without bothering to go to Samaray. I could not, however, do this. I had to go to Samaray, because the place was the official port of entry for the Papuan groups and all the Louisiades and because the gold men had to get their outfit there. I beat on. To the north of me were unlit reefs, a long line of them stretching from the eastern end of Sudest to New Guinea, with here and there a few narrow passages through. To the south of me were more reefs. I had only the sea room in between them in which to beat, and the set which hereto had been to the west was now running eastwards at 50 to 60 miles a day, dead against me. The engine was useless against adverse conditions in the open sea, and I did not think of it, though I would have used it if I could. We had to overcome these difficulties without power. The weather was so bad and the visibility so poor that I knew I should be lucky to see the reefs before I got on them. And if I got on them, we all stayed. I had to be careful. The rain beat down upon the ship in sheets, the wind blew at gale force, and I began to think this must be the outer region of another cyclonic disturbance. We heard later that this most certainly was, and the ship under short canvas lurched and stumbled. The goldmen sprawling in the chart house bemoaned their fate, though this did not help anybody. The man from Sudest sucked nervously at his teeth and eyed the seas with alarm. He forgot now that he had been, at least in Collins Street, a master mariner. My weakened rigging was a serious handicap, though we had made a tolerable repair of the fractured trestle trees with wire lashings, and had fished the sprung main topgallant mast. The 3 royal yards had to come down. And the flying jib was unbent. I could not show a topgallant sail to anything of a breeze. To repair this damage properly was a big job which could not be undertaken at sea. I had to find some quiet atoll somewhere, if I could, a place like Nassau, get the 4 topmasts down on deck, and make a new main topgallant mast. In the meantime I could do nothing but beat on. The goldmen moaned and moaned. The weather continued squally and unpleasant. Several times I saw the reefs again, each time driven further down to leeward. At last, on a clear day, the ship, close-hauled on the port tack and under a press of sail, approached the line of the Papon reefs at a place which I thought was near to Bramble Haven. I had decided that since I could not beat against the set outside, I would adopt the desperate measure of getting in among the reefs and making Samaray by the inside passage. Determined on this as the only possible means of accomplishing the difficult voyage, I stood boldly on. The manner in which the ship was being set to the eastward was sadly apparent as she approached the reefs. I hoped that in the inside passage the sets might sometimes change and not forever be against me, but it was a dangerous way to go, as I well knew, and examination of the charts was not comforting. No survey of these waters covered much of the area through which I had to pass, which meant that nobody knew what was there. You had to look for yourself. Caution: little is known of the extent and depths of the shoals in this vicinity, apparently very shoal. Breakers reported here. Conflict group reported 2 3/4 miles further to the southeast. Reported clear passage on this line. So ran the legends on the Admiralty chart, the latest one available. There are no lights, not even in the Jamard entrance. which is commonly used by steamers bound to the Far East from Australian ports. With regards to the sets and even the tides, the information was more ambiguous. These were almost completely guess work, and they were all strong. The reefs that were charted came up sheer from the sea, many of them with no warning soundings. There were few anchorages, very few. The sets depicted were invariably across the channels instead of running clearly through them one way or the other. The whole chart indicated as bewildering a set of navigational difficulties as ever a square-rigged ship, I thought, could be called upon to face. Clear passage along this line. That was all very well, but how was I to find the line, when the few small Ks from which bearings might have been taken were out of position? How keep upon it when the strong sets were incalculable? This whole area was further complicated and confused by the abundance of tide rips, eddies, and overfalls, many of which cause so severe a disturbance of the surface water that they have every appearance of coral reefs. Where a series of overfalls meets the sea of a fresh breeze, breakers are apt to be reported. Breakers usually mean reefs. The multitudinous display of reefs of this kind adds further to the already full load of the navigator's perplexities. The whole zone of the reef-studded Melanesian seas is enough to make a master mariner gray. My full sympathy went out to the masters of steamships, who habitually, though not from choice, navigate these waters. A steamer, moreover, has to run to schedule, and this was one curse I was spared. If I had the conditions too greatly against me, I could anchor if I could find anchorage, of course. The steamer must make her port when she is expected. The safe conduct of valuable vessels and passengers and cargo through those New Guinea waters is little assisted by the charts or other aids to navigation. The difficulties, indeed, are more than any master mariner ought to be called upon to face. However, there I was, standing towards Bramble Haven, determined to reach Saint-Marais by the inside passage, since there was no other way of getting there under the conditions. I cleared the southwestern horn of the Bramble Haven reefs, conning the ship from the 4 cross trees, with my heart sometimes in my mouth. But it became instantly obvious that we should not be able to get through between the Long Reef and Bramble Haven. There was a further reef to leeward, another of the haven's surrounding reefs, and this I could not weather. We were being set directly upon it. What then was I to do in this predicament? There was only one course open to me, and that was to bear away at once and run into Bramble Haven. This I did from my vantage point aloft. I watched the seas breaking on the reefs close by, and as we came into the haven's entrance, I saw the coral bottom of the huge lagoon suddenly sheer up. God, the sight was nerve-wracking after many hours without sleep, and long-continued struggle with adversity. How could I guess the depths? The leadsmen were sounding in stalwart relays, but the trouble with coral is its unevenness. Even from aloft there is scant difference discernible between a depth of 2 fathoms, which is not safe, and depths of 5 and 6 fathoms, which are. Too often one discovers the shallow water only with the ship's keel. Much of the coral here is black, showing the misleading darkness of good depth. Coral usually gives quick betrayal of shallows, but this is not invariably the case. I stood on, the soundings were all right. The entrance was clear as far as could be seen. The whole great lagoon was clear, but now that I was in it, I could not very well get out. Evening was coming on. It would have been madness to try the inside route to Saint-Marais between Long Reef and the conflicts by night. I might have run through the break in the northwestern reefs of the haven, but it was too dark now to pilot by eye among coral reefs. There was anchorage in the haven. I anchored, and thanked God. I put out the dinghy and sounded around. She was all right. I lay there throughout the night as safe anchorage by the Dupré Islands on the northern side of the lagoon. The next day the wind was fresh from the northwest, with rain squalls, and I stayed at the anchorage. Since we were now delayed at Bramble Haven, I thought we might as well examine the place, which was not without interest. It was a large lagoon, more than 10 miles across diagonally, with 5 small islands set upon the reefs of the northern side. I landed on 4 of these islands, all of which were uninhabited. I landed on the 3 Duprés and Punauan. The Duprés are not of much use except for driftwood on them, but Punauan, the easternmost, seemed inhabitable. On the others we saw only birds, crabs, and eels swimming in the rock pools, and on one of them the tracks of a 4-footed animal, which might have been a cat, though how a cat could get there I have no idea. We did not see the creature, but the tracks were fresh that morning. The islets are silent except for the faint sound of the wind in the foliage. The great lagoon is silent and weird, as if it were half-formed, an infant of an atoll growing these 1,000 years to go on growing countless thousands more. Man is unwanted, unnecessary there. The small waves of the green water turn softly on the golden beaches in the interiors of the small islands. The mangroves stand impenetrable in the marsh. Punauan is older, drier, warmer, higher, and more clear. It is inhabitable and occasionally inhabited. It seemed to be used by parties of natives, probably from the Louisiades, who came to fish and take the turtle. I saw a grass hut well made, surrounded by the sign of the tambu, to keep away marauders. Strings of the dried skins of turtle eggs swung from the trees, and there were other curious insignia of the dread tambu. Some of the island had been planted for copra once, though the palms had long been uncared for. Pawpaw grew there, and in shaded clearing was a primitive arrangement for catching water, and some putrid water in an old iron tank. Here, too, was a dug-out canoe, hidden under leaves. The stems of the palms nearby bore the hieroglyphs of many strange native names, cut in deeply with European knives. Some of them seemed recent. We saw several places where the natives had feasted on turtle and had flung the well-cleaned calabash aside. This and the ashes and the marks of feet were all that remained. By the firm beach we saw the tracks of a lone native, recently made, but there was no one on the island. Pigeons cooed in the thick wood of the northern end. The undergrowth everywhere rustled with the hurried escape of big lizards. In the lagoon fish abounded. The grass hut seemed livable. It contained sleeping mats and a rough table made from twigs. There were no utensils of any kind, nothing but a native drum, and which the lone occupant had beguiled the evening hours. He was gone now, and it looked as if it was some time since the drum had been used. Punauan was livable enough. It was a pleasant island, but somehow I would not care to stay there. the attraction of wandering on forgotten beaches and primitive life and all that kind of thing is much more appealing when one sits in an armchair and reads books. That beach was mighty hot, and existence on that lonely island would have been maddening after a while. On the beach of the Lesser Dupre, the central one, the young cadet Stormalong kicked up a skull from the sand. It was weather-worn and small. It might have been a woman's, whoever she was. She had at some time suffered a hearty clout on the head. How had the skull come to that lonely place? If natives did not live there, they would scarcely use it as a burial ground. It was too far from the nearest populated group, the conflicts or the Debonis, to be burial ground for them. It is not long since strange things happened in these neighborhoods. The tribes of the remoter Fergusons are said still to be partial to human flesh. Perhaps this was the skull of some victim of a long-past feast. I had no means of telling. Perhaps the youth, if it had been a youth, had slipped on a banana peel on the beach, and in falling cleft his skull on a trunk. The discovery of a human skull, bleached in sand, of Dupre, was food for fantasy. The following morning was flat calm, and I went out under power.